Dreams for Dark Nights.
Ultrasound by Kevin Thomas. Narrated by Jesse Cornett. Part 1. As a science teacher, making the subject interesting was always the biggest challenge. But that was the bit of the job that I loved. Finding some way to make the subject interesting. There were some classes it was really easy. Some were just naturally interested in what made the world tick. Some got all starry-eyed at the idea of infinite universes, destructive black holes, chemical explosions, classifying all the creepy crawlies that lived in the world. Some classes were harder to grab, though, and you had to really find something to pull them in. It was even more fun to figure out, like teaching taxonomical classifications using Pokemon, or using some sci-fi to explore the ideas of space and time. Sometimes just a good old-fashioned blowing something the fuck up. Well, every now and then, though, you had to get a really tough group. It was even worse when it came to teaching a subject that they found particularly dull. And one class in particular was an unholy boiling point of hormone-fueled disruption. I'd love to say I didn't consider them bad kids, but the inbuilt liberal apologism most teachers have hardwired into them can only take so much punishment. Now, they all had their reasons, of course, broken homes, runaway parents, bad areas, drugs, alcohol, or just plain learning and development needs that we didn't have the time or the funds to accommodate properly. With all the justification in the world, I didn't stop every lesson for them from blurring the fine line between learning and riot control. I even approached my head a year for advice or support. He was normally a man who preached the gospel of no child left behind, every child matters, or with religious fervor, in fact. However, even he, having provided cover teaching for the group in a pinch, simply looked at me with sunken, defeated eyes and told me, "You're on your own with him, mate." And the best he could offer would be to steer the school observations away from those classes and to cast a sympathetic eye over my end-of-year results. A token gesture, and it didn't stop the lessons being a constant struggle to retain control. For instance, one kid, Jake, took a lesson about evolution and survival of the fittest to be a personal challenge to his finely honed fighting skills. And the rest of the lesson was primarily concerned with me attempting to stop the class degenerating into a battle royale. I taught a lesson about alkali metals, a family of metals which have a violent reaction with water, by putting a tiny pea-sized amount in a bowl of water and letting him see it skitter around before popping with a tiny bang. This lesson was rewarded by a break-in to the chemical cupboard that night. That was followed by a missing 100-gram block of potassium and a mysterious explosion that destroyed half the plumbing in the gym's shower block. I was out of ideas, and at the end of my tether, and I'd resigned myself to simply embracing my new role as riot officer and condemning the class to oblivion. However, I had one of those soul-searching moments and thought that, no, everyone deserves one last chance. It was my class, my subject, and damn it, I was a grown-ass man and would not be defeated by a bunch of foul-mouthed, wanking little scroats. And I checked the curriculum, and the next subject to be taught would be sound waves. Ultrasound and subsonic waves in particular. So now I had to find what was the hook to draw them in. Had I known what would happen, I would have stopped right there. But I didn't. I plowed on, trying to find some way to make the subject of sound waves you can't hear interesting. I found plenty of experiments, using ultrasound to break glass. I didn't fancy giving them any excuse to break glass. Using it to break up kidney stones? The kids knew enough about weapons, thanks. Or the way animals use it for navigation. But I didn't fancy teaching them to add horrific new screeches to their Batman impersonations. I'd all but given up on finding anything useful when I stumbled across an article on scientific explanations for the paranormal based on sounds that existed outside the normal hearing range. And the article was fascinating. A scientist called Gavreau had noticed that certain areas of a particular laboratory made anyone who worked there feel uneasy and scared. Some went as far as to say they'd seen ghosts and shadowy figures in that part of the lab. Few would dare work there, and fewer would dare twice. And being a man of science, the researcher rejected any supernatural claims and set up monitoring equipment around the area to investigate. And what he found was that the area was a hotbed of subsonic sound waves. And there were all kinds of research equipment in and around the lab, like centrifuges and auto stirrers and incubators, all creating sound waves inaudible to the human ear, but that created a feeling of dread and terror in anyone that was subjected to them. Paranormal research critics were quick to point out that while subsonic waves might account for the feelings of dread, they asked how this explains the visions of ghostly and shadowy figures that were also reported in the lab. And Gavreau postulated that the waves caused the front of the eyes to vibrate, and that this could distort sight, and inducing visions of horrific shadow men and other tormentors. I even read that Gavreau was planning to expand his research into whether this might explain other ghost reports. For instance, the huge increase in ghost sightings during building projects like extensions to the London Underground tube lines, often blamed on disturbed graves and inappropriate planners. It may be nothing more than subsonic waves caused by digging machines. Yes, this was perfect. I couldn't believe my luck. It was such a simple experiment to set up in the classroom, and even the most hardened little thugs get even quickly silenced when they think ghosts are in the room. And then once they're thoroughly terrified, bam! Science. And I was grinning from ear to ear at this point. I couldn't wait. For the first time ever, I was actually looking forward to the next lesson. I was so naive. I should have looked deeper. The irony of the fact that everything that unfolded from here on out is down to the fact that I, teacher of the worst class in the country, didn't do my homework. And it would have been hilarious were it not for the tragedy of what was to come. I finished my lesson plan and went to bed, getting the last good night's sleep I'd ever enjoy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Part 2. The morning came and I still had a confident spring in my step. I even treated myself to a nice coffee on the way to work. I started doing that criminal thing that you do when you think you've had a good idea, then let the fantasy run away with itself. After all, I just figured out how I was going to control that class. My head of year didn't know how to do that. Maybe this would lead to a promotion. Maybe I'd be next in line for the head of department. Maybe I could include it in my book that I was going to write about controlling classrooms. Maybe I'd be invited on TV to explain it, and how I'd turn this obnoxious class around. I knew I was getting way ahead of myself, but hey, it was a daydream for the commute. And where was the harm in letting it run a little? I got to my room, and I started setting up the equipment. They were going to be my first class of the day, so I wouldn't have to wait forever, which was lucky because at this point I could barely contain myself. And the equipment was very simple. There was going to be a simple speaker at the front of the classroom, which was going to be the focal point of the display, but in the back corners there was going to be a simple setup of a couple of metal plates held in front of electromagnets. And they were all going to be set to the same subsonic frequency that Gavreau had used, and I hoped the acoustics of the room would amplify the effect. The class piled in and took their places, and they were already starting to play up, but a couple were disquieted by the calm, confident look on my face. There wasn't much that gave any of their teachers cause for that kind of collected facial expression in their classes. Most had a look of barely concealed fear and trepidation. So to see me looking like a Hindu cow shook their confidence. I had to capitalize on this brief period of crumbled bravado before they collected themselves. "Sound!" I bellowed. What is it? My question was met with stony silence, as most of my attempts to engage them were. Sound is a form of energy wave. For the most part, it allows us to hear things. I subtly turned on the speakers to their subsonic frequency. It was at a low amplitude, so it's unlikely anyone would be perceiving anything yet. However, scientists are still discovering new ways that the body interacts with energy in all its forms. Every day, we find out new mechanisms by which the body is sensitive to energy. Every day, we find a new way to explain the unexplainable by using rigorous scientific method to observe, predict, experiment, and analyze. I tweaked the intensity up a few notches and saw a few of their bored expressions shift to one much less complacent. I was loving this, truly loving it. I almost didn't know whether I was getting an adrenaline rush from finally controlling this unruly class, or whether the sound waves were starting to get to me too. There was a bubbling panic growing in my chest, but I was sure that was just down to the excitement of the position. Even if I was also being affected, no reason why I wouldn't be, just because I was aware of it. At least I knew that I was in control. And if you kids really apply yourselves, really buckle down and stop giving me shit. I couldn't believe I just wanted my class. The excitement was almost too much. Then maybe you'd be able to use science to achieve something. I paused and scanned over their increasingly distressed faces to ensure I really had them before I went to the grand finale. Really special. I cranked the intensity of the sound way up to full. I saw an instant shift in their demeanor. It was beautiful. A few started crying, some hid their eyes, some were just frantically looking around, wondering if they were the only ones, and quickly seeing that they weren't. I almost started scaring myself. I looked across their terrified faces and watched them scrambling and pleading with me and each other and God, anyone to make it stop. This started to feel like revenge rather than science. Every crappy lesson, every fight, every interruption, every curse, every punch, and every missed piece of homework was all avenged as I watched the class descend into pure, terrified panic. Then, there was a shift. I don't know why I'd been slower to respond, but all of a sudden the sound waves got to me too. All of a sudden, I saw what they were seeing. I understood their fear. Shadowy figures swooped and darted around the peripheries of my vision. The corner of my eye was a dance of barely seen terrors. However, when one of the shadows appeared to dash right across the classroom, I realized I'd gone too far. This was terrifying even for me, and I knew none of it was real. This needed to stop now, before it went any further. I killed the power to all the speakers. Instantly, the room was back to normal. No figures. No shadows. Nothing clawing at the extremities of your vision. Just another classroom full of clearly unsettled children. I regained control of myself and calmly explained to the class exactly what had happened. We went into detail about sound waves and energy transfer and the retina, and the eye's lenses, the whole lot. I knew I'd way overstepped the mark, and I didn't want to send a single child out until I was sure they knew that it was all an illusion, that there were no ghosts, no evil shadows, just a scientific trick of the mind. Most of the class had recovered by the time they needed to leave for their next lesson. A couple still shaken, but I was satisfied that all they needed was a bit of a sit-down. I'd certainly knocked them down a peg or two. Amazingly, Jake even looked me right in the eye and said, "Nice one," before moving on. I was in a better mood than I'd been in all year. I told the head of year, and he let out a laugh so loud and appreciative I was sure half the surrounding classes had heard. "God, I wish I'd been there," he chuckled. He then put his stern professional face on and said, "But you should really run these kinds of things past me first. If one of their parents complains." He trailed off, before looking at me again and letting his stern facade break into another wide, appreciative grin. I stayed on cloud 9 until later that evening. Everything was fine until the sun went down, and it started getting a bit dark. I could have sworn I saw another shadow dart into hiding out of the corner of my eye. First time it happened, I was still full of bravado, thinking, I know what caused that. It must be the roadworks down the street. The pneumatic drill must be vibrating my windows just right. At that point, I actually believed myself. However, as the light continued to fade, the twilight carried on playing tricks on me. I kept seeing dancing in the shadows long after road crews had gone home. I tried just getting an early night, but I couldn't. As soon as I felt myself drifting off, I'd see more movement in the shadows. Hard as I tried, I kept seeing the darkness moving. They kept darting around. They darted towards, away, and around me. Sometimes they looked like they were just standing there. Other times they looked like they were ready to jump on me. My imagination was driving me wild. I couldn't take it anymore, so I bottled out. I turned on all the lights and I went on the internet. Unable to think of anything more constructive, I researched a bit more about Gavro's findings. Why didn't I do this before? Gavro's scientific studies had tapered away rather rapidly after his subsonic discovery. And from what I could see, they were replaced with increasingly erratic and less reliable conjecture about the nature and the power of the sounds and the shadows. Most of his academic companions deserted him as he got more and more unhinged. I remembered the power I felt manipulating the class, and I remembered having to tell myself that it was just an illusion. What if Gavro lost that grip on reality? And what if he kept pushing it until he forgot the science and believed his own pranks? I was hardly comforted when I found out that his final conclusion from his final published research paper, widely discredited by all who found it, was that the sound didn't make you see ghosts. The sound let you see ghosts that were already there. And they didn't appreciate being seen. And I couldn't sleep a wink. It didn't look like any of the class did either when I saw them the next day. Saggy-eyed, drowsy, and yawning, I asked them what was up. "Kept seeing shadows, sir," said one, and many murmured in agreement. Worse, though, was that one student hadn't turned up at all. Jake was absent. Not especially unusual. A lot of students played truant when given a chance, but something didn't sit right. I asked if any of the other students had heard anything from him. One girl timidly replied, "He texted me last night, sir. Said he couldn't sleep. Said he needed to find what was making the sound so he could turn it off." I just hoped he found it. I just hope he got some sleep. I hope we all would. Part 3. For good measure, I spent the remainder of the lesson going over the science behind my little illusion again, in order to try and allay their uncertainties and fears. It was almost funny. This lesson went even better than the previous one, as every student was held in a rapt state of attention, and the whole class clung onto my every word. They took notes, drew diagrams, asked deep and pertinent questions on and around the subject, and they even completed all of their group work, with nary a ripple of disruption. I understood, of course, exactly what they were doing. They were trying their very best to understand what had happened to them yesterday, so that they could really try and put it behind them. I'd always seen scientists as brave pioneers into the unknown, but looking across their steadily brightening faces, I saw how science could just as easily be a comforting blanket, a rational barrier against the demons of the unknown. And by the end of the class, the horror of the previous day seemed to have well and truly faded and been replaced by a joking camaraderie. Kids who would have normally have been at each other's throats in group sessions were working without issue. They even seemed positively friendly with each other, in a way only a group who've experienced a shared hardship could be. It was a fantastic sight. My earlier doubts about whether I'd gone too far were still there, but to look at them working productively and peacefully with each other, it was difficult to be too concerned. Jake still played on my mind, though. I'm sure he was fine. He made truancy into an art form, but his texts about needing to turn off the sound in the middle of the night still made me nervous. But the lesson had one last shot for my nerves in store. It concluded without issue, and concerns for Jake aside, I genuinely thought that maybe I'd turned a corner with this class. I'd need to be far more careful if I was going to use it with any other classes in the future, though. I'd been completely unprepared for the intensity of the visions and the feelings of sheer terror. But it didn't seem to be anything that a bit of personal experimentation with the equipment couldn't refine in order to get the right level. And just looking at the quality of work that class had just produced, it was going to be easy to get the head of science to sign off on the experiment for further use. I was still running through these thoughts and contemplating what modifications to try next when, as the class were leaving, one girl asked to see me for a minute. In the now empty classroom, she stood, staring intently at her shoes and refusing to look me in the eye. "What is it, Amy?" She shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Sir, did..." She was having trouble formulating a question. Were the speakers on just then?" "When?" "During the lesson." "No." "Why?" The color drained from her face as she weakly answered. "Oh, nothing. It's nothing." She scuttled out, clearly needing to be anywhere but in that classroom. I wanted to call after her, chase her even, in order to clarify what she meant, but I was distracted by something skittering across the room out of the corner of my eye. I didn't get a clear look, and by the time I'd spun round to try and see, it had gone. I turned back to the corridor to shout after Amy, but she too had disappeared just as suddenly. Her question had disturbed me, and my mind returned to Jake. I used the morning break to contact the office to see if there was any word on him. Jake Tandy, Class G2. Any word from him or his parents as to where he is today?" I asked the office girl in charge of monitoring attendance. She was about to answer when a gray smudge darted across the doorway to my right and pulled my attention away. I was still staring intently at the door when, out of nowhere, Richard, my head of year, stuck his head into the room and asked to borrow me for a moment. He ushered me into his office and closed the door. Jake Tandy was reported missing as of 9:30 a.m. this morning. What? By whom? His mother. When she noticed he wasn't in his bed this morning, she called round a couple of his girlfriends' houses to find out if he'd snuck out there in the night. None of them had seen him. And when she called us to find out if he was in school, we told her he wasn't here. Her next call, obviously, was to the police. Now, one of our students is officially missing. My mind was overwhelmed with questions. The playful grin that was on his face when I first told him of the demonstration was well and truly gone now, replaced by an unshifting expression of grave concern. The police found Jake's phone in his room. The final message sent details him going to find the source of a sound. They want to know what that means. Of course. Do they need a formal statement? I don't know. You can ask them for yourself. They want to talk to you as soon as we're finished. Now listen, and listen carefully. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell you how serious the consequences of this could be if Jake doesn't turn up quickly. This experiment you ran. Please tell me you ran some basic safety tests or ran a risk assessment. How could I have been so stupid? I didn't so much as do a test run before the lesson, let alone do something as sensible as documenting a full risk assessment, or investigate whether infrasound fell under COSHH regulations. My complete unforgivable incompetence must have been written across my face. Because before I could answer, Richard interrupted. You fucking fool. I had to focus all of my strength not to burst into tears right there in his office. My eyes were damp, but I maintained composure. Answer me this, and you had better answer truthfully, Richard continued. Do you have any cause for any form of concern for any of your other students? Amy, I uttered quietly, still staring at my hands to avoid revealing my increasingly watery eyes. What? I raised my head to meet his accusatory gaze. Amy Sunderland. She approached me after class today to ask... My heart stopped. Stood over each of Richard's shoulders were two towering, shadowy figures. Through the blur of my tears, I couldn't make out even basic features. I wasn't even sure they had any. All I could see were that they were definitely human-shaped. I was frozen with dread, and feeling of deep panic started welling up in my stomach. What? What did Amy ask? I rubbed my eyes dry in order to answer him. Once I'd cleared my sight, the figures were gone. I looked around, but there was nothing, and no one else there anymore. Answer me, damn it! She asked if I had the speakers on during today's lesson. I tried to ask her why, but she wouldn't answer me. And did you have them on? No. Right. Tell the police that. Tell them everything. I'll send them in. Richard stood up to leave and walked towards the door. I felt him stand behind me and place a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I couldn't believe how irresponsible I'd been. How reckless. I'd been so caught up in my own ambition that I hadn't even taken basic precautions, and now I was paying for it. I just hoped Jake was all right. I knew Richard was furious with me, but feeling his protective hand on my shoulder meant maybe there was a way to fix it all. I heard Richard outside telling the officers to head in. Wait. Richard was outside. Then whose hand was... I spun round to see an empty room. I desperately tried to contain the panic now coursing through my veins. What was happening to me? It was just a fucking illusion. 2 officers entered the room. Hello, good morning. Thanks for talking with us. Now, tell me about, infrasound? Through the tension, I almost laughed. Where to begin? Part 4. I'd rarely seen police officers as young as the 2 opposite me. They lacked the authoritative confidence one would normally expect during questioning in a missing child case. And the questions, too, were meandering and unfocused, as though the officers really didn't know what they were actually trying to achieve or elicit from me. And my guess was that they were junior dogs' bodies who had been lumped with the dull task of closing off a dead-end lead. And when a child goes missing, every lead needs to be chased, if only to protect the force against accusations of neglect if the search fails. But Jake was a troubled kid, and I knew he'd been caught dealing weed to other pupils. I imagined that the officers in charge of the case had a stack of leads that provided far more plausible explanations as to why a kid with links to the local low-level drug dealers might mysteriously go missing in the night. He wasn't going to waste his best officers chasing down a science teacher using strange noises to fill a room with ghosts. These officers were here on a glorified administrative mission. I could see their resentment in their eyes. But for their lack of experience and motivation, they were diligent nonetheless. They wanted more detail about the nature of infrasound and what it could mean in the context of Jake's text. So we discussed it in some detail. I delivered a mini science lesson in the nature of low-frequency wave energy, natural resonance, and how the retina could be fooled into seeing things that weren't there. Describing it was almost therapeutic, given everything that had just happened. As I'd felt my grasp on reality slipping, it was good to go over the simple, rational explanation for it to help me regain my grip. I answered all of their questions about Jake. Apparently, all they found in Jake's home computer was a few articles about shadow people and ghosts, as well as a few research articles on unrelated medical procedures. And they wanted to know if the 2 could be linked, but I explained that Jake's mum was a nurse in the nearby hospital. If anyone was searching for methicillin-resistant staph, aureus treatments, or subcranial hematomas, or fecal emulsification techniques, then it was probably her. Shadow people knew porn, though? That sounded more like Jake. Eventually, I had no further questions. Their theories were obviously not something I was supposed to be privy to. Their relative greenness as officers meant they let slip more than they should when exchanging tidbits. And from what I could gather, they thought that my experiment had probably spooked him, leading to a sleepless night. In his insomnia, he probably tried to sneak out to visit a girlfriend, but had fallen afoul of one of his less amiable contacts en route. This was an implication that, even at 15, Jake already owed some serious people money. The officers had what they needed to close this lead. I was thanked for my help, and they left. Richard seemed visibly relieved when I explained to him everything we'd talked about. He'd clearly been driving himself crazy thinking the cops were investigating a case of neglect at the school and that he was going to be facing legal action over inappropriate experiments being conducted in the classroom. However, although the panic had faded, his anger had not. "Clean up this mess now. Talk to all your students from yesterday. Find out if any of them are still having problems and fix it. Make sure they know there's nothing to worry about. If I get so much of a report of a broken night's sleep from one of their parents, then you're finished." I sent messages out to all the students and asked them to come see me as soon as possible, as Richard had agreed to cover the rest of my day's classes. I interviewed them one by one, asking what they'd seen since the experiment. Most told stories about occasional glimpses of something in the dark. No one told me that he was so scared that he hadn't been able to do any of his homework. Nice try, I thought, but I kept my solemn face on. However, most had been able to nod off eventually, and few complained of anything further stretching into the daytime. In fact, when really pushed, most seemed to agree that anything they had seen was just their imagination going into overdrive. Secretly, I had my doubts as to how many of their visions truly were imaginary, but the calmer they were, the less they were affected. And if they truly did see fewer shadows, the less they believed. Then I was going to let them carry on and watch the problem solve itself. The end of the day came, and I looked over the register of the class to see who I'd managed to talk to. I'd managed to tick off everyone bar two: Jake and Amy. I hadn't seen Amy all day since she approached me after the lesson. I hurried to the administrative department to report it, but Amy had apparently been picked up by her father earlier that morning, claiming to be suffering from a massive headache. I breathed a sigh of relief. I could talk to her tomorrow, and hopefully another night's sleep would put the whole thing to bed. And with Amy safe at home, the day over, and Jake still nowhere to be found, I went back to my place. I poured myself a whiskey and stood at the window, watching the sun go down over the city horizon. It was normally a beautiful sight. This was one of the principal reasons I paid so much for this flat. But today, it held no such pleasure. The sun got lower, and I watched as the tall buildings' shadows elongated into the evening. There was something about the way the shadows were creeping across the streets and over the hedges and walls towards my windows that set my heart racing. Of course, it was just the angle of the sun, but for all the panic of the last 2 days, it was difficult to not feel an almost predatory feel to their approach. The way the shadows snaked through the trees and poured through my windows. The way the black imprints of the lampposts and power lines created long, grasping fingers that crawled up into my room. Soon, the whole city seemed to be cloaked in a dusky twilight, and every shadow seemed to writhe and pulsate. The wind blew the trees, and the shadows swayed on my walls, like a cobra waiting to strike. I downed the whiskey, and threw on all the lights for comfort, but there was no comfort to be had. The harsh, bright lights just turned my flat into a patchwork of shadows. And behind the couch, behind the TV, over the cupboards, and anywhere that bright central light couldn't reach was suddenly turned into a pool of darkness. A darkness that stared and watched and waited and mocked. A darkness that demanded to hold my gaze just so that it could gaze right back at me. And I poured another whiskey, bringing it to my mouth, taking a deep swig, when through the distorted lens of the bottom of the glass, I saw a blurry, dark figure stood in front of me. I was paralyzed. The whiskey slopped against my teeth and burned my tongue, but I didn't dare swallow. I didn't dare move. I just watched as the shadowy figure towered, motionless, begging me to react. Then eternity passed in between the poundings of my heart. The vapor of the whiskey almost tickled my nostrils, and in that moment of lapsed concentration, the shadowy figure charged at me. I screamed and flailed, sending my glass shattering against the nearby wall. But then nothing. In the instant our gaze had broken, the figure was gone. I stood panting and breathless, my heart beating so loud I couldn't hear. I was sweating burnt adrenaline and shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I brought my hand up, and grabbing a handful of hair, I collapsed backwards against the cupboard and slid to the floor. If not believing was the key to not seeing these things, then I was doomed forever. Gavro was right. He must have been. These ghosts were already here. I just let them out. But what did they want? I don't know how long I sat there for. It felt like hours. Soon, though, I found my composure. I found the courage to stand up. I poured another whiskey. But the shadows were still there. In every alcove, nook, and cranny of furniture, there was another drape of shadow waiting to pounce. I had to get out of that place. Right then. I wandered the streets until I found an internet cafe that was open until late. Better still, they too had whiskey. I wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing, just blind, meaningless surfing of anything that came to mind. Given the evening I'd had, pictures of kittens were a central theme. However, through my aimless Googling, one particular results page came up. Result 1, as usual, was a wiki article. And I figured there was no harm in reading it in case anyone ever asked. So I clicked it. I felt my stomach lurch and my heart sink. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 999. I knew where Jake was. I just hoped I was in time. Part 5. And by the time I got to hospital, the police were already there. I should have known there was no way they'd let me see Jake, but the police were very eager to talk. My tongue couldn't keep pace with my brain, and the gargled mess of questions that I barraged the police with were barely coherent. An officer I hadn't met before raised an authoritative hand to silence me. "Please, sir, follow me. We have some further questions." "Is he all right?" "Sir, if you'd please, just follow me." I was ushered into a small room and sat down on a squeaky and uncomfortable chair. The officer took his place behind the desk. What the hell was this room? What kind of a hospital has an interrogation room? The officer was not one I recognized. He certainly wasn't with the two who questioned me earlier. He was older, comfortably so, a good 10 years without a doubt. He was also harder and more experienced. His stony face revealed nothing of his intentions and how much he knew, and I imagined that, unlike the two rookies who questioned me earlier, I wasn't going to find a damn thing he didn't want me to know.
You're Jake's teacher, correct? The one who placed the 999 call?
Yes, that's me. Is Jake all right?
No, but he will survive.
I couldn't tell whether to be relieved or not. The officer's poker face refused to let slip anything that could calm my fears for Jake. But he's alive?
Yes. Now, tell me, how did you know where to find Jake? How did you know he'd be here?
I was a guess. Something your officers asked me about earlier. He held my gaze, revealing nothing, and taunting me into carrying on. Your officers... That is, the infrasound.
Yes, this ghost noise of yours.
He interrupted with the tone of a man sick of entertaining the idea that there was anything at play here other than an off-the-rails kid in trouble. However, there was the faintest flicker of doubt in his eyes, as though he'd seen something he couldn't reconcile with his foregone conclusion. The infrasound interferes with your eye's lens. It makes you see things that aren't there. Terrible things. Jake's text about turning off the noise made me think that he was still seeing them, and that maybe that had something to do with his disappearance. The officer remained stoic. I had no doubt this was a man well versed in allowing criminals to hang themselves with their words, with nothing other than the blunt force of his silence. Then this morning, your officers were talking to me about things that were in Jake's search history. Most of it was unsurprising given the nature of the vision and the nature of him being a 15-year-old boy. Then they mentioned some medical terms he'd also been searching for. At first I figured they were from his mum, as she's a nurse, and I didn't see any connection between them and the infrasonic visions. Still nothing. The officer was going to wait until I told him everything before he played his hand in return. Out of curiosity, I Googled the ones I hadn't heard of. The faintest twitch disturbed the officer's rigid gaze. Phacoemulsification. I finally spilt my finding. It's a form of eye surgery based on using ultrasound to break up cataracts. I saw Jake's logic straight away. I fucked up his eyes using infrasound. Maybe he thought he could fix them using ultrasound. I knew with his mum working here, he'd know the layout and maybe even have the means to gain access to the relevant wards. That was when I called you. Now please, tell me what happened to Jake. At this point, my mind was almost at breaking point. I just needed to know what was happening. The officer took his time to consider revealing what he knew, and eventually he leaned in close and said softly,
Jake Tandy blinded himself using the ultrasonic equipment in the ophthalmology lab. Now, I don't know whether that was what he intended to do, but that was a result.
My jaw dropped.
He directed 2 focused waves of ultrasound into each eye and destroyed the lens and retina. Nurses found him curled by the still-running machine, and when they tried to approach him, he lashed out at the sound of their approaching footsteps and screamed to be left alone. He calmed as soon as he heard their voices, and he was sobbing apologies for his outburst, saying, "I thought you were them." The nurses said He kept simply repeating, "They're gone. Can't see them. They're gone. I can't see them," as they took him to the intensive care. He was smiling. I was gonna be sick. I'm so sorry, Jake. I truly am. I never intended for any of this. Please believe me. Willie, is he... I stammered. As I said, he will live. There's no way to save his sight, and he will need extensive therapy. At this point, the officer leaned in closer. He had the same look of steely authority on his face that Richard had when he originally questioned me about the other affected pupils. He was mentally searching for something, anything that could be used to pin this on me. But he was falling short. There were no regulations in place regarding infrasound, even in a concentrated experiment. So they couldn't even charge me with professional misconduct, let alone assault. I was free to go. Instead, he simply held my gaze and asked in a bullying tone, "Anything else to tell me?" There were hundreds of things. I wanted to tell him Jake was right. I wanted to tell him we were both being stalked by shadowy beings. I wanted to tell him my apartment was an inhospitable orgy of demonic head fuckery. But I didn't. At this point, I must have already looked insane enough without the truth making things worse. I simply whimpered, "No," like a kicked puppy. In that case, you're free to go. But look," he said, softening his tone momentarily, "if you think of anything else, here's my number." I was walking out of the hospital car park when a thought hit me like a brick. Amy. I'd failed Jake, and for that I could never forgive myself, but I could still save Amy. Oh, please let me be in time to save Amy. I immediately called the detective. "Look, I'm still at the hospital. Can you meet me downstairs? I've thought of someone else you need to speak to," I told him. When the officer arrived in the cold, comfortably well-lit hospital reception area, I told him, "You need to send someone to check on Amy Sunderland. She went home complaining of headaches, and she too complained of seeing the same shadows as Jake long after the experiment had finished." I don't see any reports of a missing Amy Sutherland. "Sunderland, look, she's not missing. She's at home. Her father collected her from school today." "Listen, I appreciate your concern, but I can't send officers over to someone's house to see if a 15-year-old girl has recovered from a headache." "Just please, send someone. I don't know her address, but her parents are Lydia and James Sunderland. I think she might be in danger. She reported exactly the same symptoms as Jake, just a few hours behind. If she's following the same path, then we might not have long enough to prevent the same thing happening again. Please!" The officer fell silent. This wasn't the same authoritative silence he'd used to intimidate me during questioning. This was the genuine sound of indecision. He'd had a shitty night. Just because Jake had been found didn't mean that this case was solved. And he'd still had the shitstorm of having to discover how a missing 15-year-old boy had been able to get access to the hospital equipment and blind himself. He was weighing up whether he could justify sending officers to check on the girl given the crime scene at the hospital. My face must have swayed him. After all, the only reason Jake was found at all was because of my hunch. So he figured it was better safe than sorry. He pulled the walkie-talkie to his mouth. Send a car round to check on the house of Lydia and James Sunderland.
Could you repeat the names?
Crackled a male voice on the other end. Lydia and Jim Sunderland, parents of Amy Sunderland, he repeated.
Sir, I don't understand. You want another car sent there?
Came the voice, still seeking clarification. What do you mean, another?
2 cars already visited this evening, sir, accompanying the ambulance, in order to assess the scene and question the parents.
The professional facade the man had put on this morning was dying in front of me. His ashen face looked ready to crumble as the implication sunk in. He looked like he wanted to shoo me away in case I overheard important information. But he didn't. What happened? He quizzed the still nonplussed radio operator.
Sorry, sir. I thought you knew.
They don't allow phones in the hospital. I haven't been updated on anything for an hour or so. Tell me.
Sir, Amy Sunderland was found dead in her room this evening. She bled to death after clawing her own eyes out. Her parents had left her sleeping off a migraine to go to cinema and found her when they returned.
My world broke. I'd failed Amy. I'd failed Jake. I failed everyone. I don't even know what happened next. In mindless days, I drifted home. It was gone midnight by this point. Barely 48 hours since I'd found that damned article. 2 days ago, I'd been a self-pitying teacher with a tough class and a lack of balls. I now had the weight of Jake's sight and Amy's life crushing me. Through the aimless gaze that was my vision, I stumbled home. I didn't care. The shadows in the streets, and the bushes, in the alleys and between the cars seemed thicker, almost solid, tangible. They seemed to reach for me, to grasp for me, touch me, and grab me. I even felt fingers on my bare skin at times. Chilled scratches ran up my arms and down my neck. But I didn't care. When I got to my door, I opened it and looked into the shadowy flat. The darkness was alive now. I could feel it. At this point, I don't think even turning the light on could have dissipated the sea of writhing blackness that engulfed my home. It pulsed and swayed and seemed to breathe as I stared into it. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was dozens of them, all dancing and mocking and taunting and begging me to join them. Inky black tendrils snaked out of the doorway and over the hallway walls like the branches of some foul tree growing out to produce some fouler fruit. Snakes of writhing black snuck across my floor towards my feet. Whatever I'd brought forth with my little science lesson wasn't going away and wasn't going to let me go. I still had another 30 kids to claim from my mistake. I could think of nothing else to say them. So as the horrific fingers of whatever lived in those shadows continued to climb up my legs, I simply walked in and closed the door behind me. I didn't care. I'm sorry.